Hey guys, in today's video, we're going to go over how to frame for a swing door in our view series. Before getting started, I want to go over the framing components needed when framing a swing door in our view series. The first framing component is the view wall start. Throughout the video, I'll be referencing two sides of the wall start. There'll be the glass side, which is designed to accept the glass, and there'll be a stud side. The stud side is designed to accept the door jambs. The next framing component is the view guide. The view guide attaches directly to the floor and directly to the ceiling. The next framing component is the view track, also known as the arrowhead given its shape. The arrowhead will sit directly on top of the view guide. In between the view track and the view guide are leveling bolts. The leveling bolts are installed into the view guide and allows you to level the view track. The next component is our flex track. The flex track is used to attach to the ceiling at the door location. The reason we use the flex track is it's designed to accept the door header. The next framing component is your door jambs. The door jambs will come in 10-foot lengths with one end mitered and one end squared off. You'll need to cut the door jambs based on the height needed. The next component is the door header. The door header will be mitered on both ends, and you'll receive them pre-cut for either a single door or a double door. The next component is our T-bracket. The T-bracket is designed to connect the flex track to the view wall start and the view guide. The next component is our Flex L bracket. The Flex L bracket is designed to connect the flex track to the view wall start. And the last component is our View L bracket. The View L bracket is designed to connect the view track, the view guide and the wall start. So the framing components covered, we'll go ahead and get started. We'll need to start on the door opening side of the partition. The first thing we'll do is measure for the view wall start on one side of the opening. Now in this case, I'm going to be attaching directly to the wall. Therefore, I'm going to take my measurement from my wall start that's going against the wall. To measure for the view wall start, you'll measure from floor to ceiling. With the measurement, I'll now cut my wall start. Place the view wall start against the wall with the stud side facing towards the center of the door opening. This would also apply for swing doors coming off of a square post or in the center of a run. Before attaching the view wall start to the wall, it is extremely important to make sure the wall start is perfectly plumb. If the wall is out of plumb, you need to make sure you place shims behind the wall start to make sure the wall start is perfectly plumb. Now, if this creates a gap between the wall and the wall start, it'll be up to you to come up with something to fill this gap. We do not provide anything to fill the gap. Once in place, you can then attach the wall start to the wall using a screw that's long enough to go through the wall start and into the wall. And we do not provide the external attaching hardware with our product. In this case, I'll be using a 2.5-inch self-tapping screw to go through the center of the view wall start and into the wall. You'll need to run about 3 to 4 screws for each vertical wall start. With the wall start installed on one side of the opening, we can now install the flex track to the ceiling within the door opening. The measurement of the flex track must be 38 inches for single door openings. When you receive the flex track, it will not be pre-cut to the length you need. So you need to make sure to measure and cut the flex track to the 38 inches for the single door opening. With the flex track cut to the proper length, we can now slide in the brackets that we'll need before attaching the flex track to the ceiling. Now for this situation where we have a flex track coming together with a view wall start, we're going to use a flex L bracket. On the opposite side of the door opening, where we have a flex track coming together with a view wall start and a view guide, we're going to use the T bracket. Once you have the L brackets slid into place, you can then attach it to the ceiling. To install the flex track, place it against the ceiling and tight to the view wall start. Then slide the flex L bracket into the center of the view wall start. Attach the L bracket to the view wall start using the 3/4 inch framing screws. We typically run 2 screws for the L bracket. With the L bracket in place, tighten the set screw on the flex L bracket. Once in place, attach the flex track to the ceiling using a screw that's long enough to go through the flex track and into the ceiling. You'll attach through the center of the flex track. With the flex track installed, we can now measure for our view wall start on the opposite side of the door opening. To measure for the view wall start on this side of the door opening, measure from floor to ceiling. Before installing the wall start, we'll need to notch out the top of the wall start to allow the T bracket to come through the wall start and into the view guide once the view guide is installed. To do this, you can use a hacksaw and a pair of pliers to notch out about a 1/2 inch from the center of the wall start. With the wall start notched, place it tight against the flex track with the stud side facing towards the center of the door opening. Then slide the T bracket through the notch and into the center of the wall start. Once in place, take a 3/4 inch framing screw and place it through the top hole only of the T bracket. The reason we do this is because if the other holes are used, the screws will contact the glass on the other side. With the hole at the top, the view track will cover the screw. Once attached, make sure you create a nice tight fit between the wall start and the flex track and tighten the set screw. On the opposite side of the wall start where you have the bracket coming through, take a flat bar and slightly bend down the bracket. What this will do is it'll allow the track guide to be installed without having to remove the T bracket. With the main framing for the door opening installed, we can now measure for the wall start on the opposite side of the partition. To measure for the wall start, measure from floor to ceiling. On this end of the partition, we're going to have glass coming into the wall start. Therefore, we need to have the glass side of the wall start facing towards the center of the opening. Place the wall start against the wall. Same as the other side, we want to make sure the wall start is perfectly plumb. Once plumb, take your attaching screw and run it through the center of the wall start, attaching it to the wall. You'll want to run around 3 to 4 screws per wall start. With the wall start installed on this side of the opening, I can now measure for the view track guide attaching to the ceiling. To measure for the view tracking guide, measure from wall start to wall start. When you receive the view tracking guide, they'll be wrapped together. Now for this case, you can actually leave them wrapped together and cut them at the same time because they will be the same length. So with that in mind, I'll go ahead and cut my view tracking guide. Before attaching the view guide to the ceiling, we'll need to prep the view guide to allow the anchoring screws to go through the track and into the ceiling. How you prep the view guide is dependent on the type of anchoring screw being used. In this case, I'll be using one of our self-tapping screws, so I need to use a step bit to make a hole large enough on the top part of the view guide to allow my other bit to fit inside the view track and run my anchoring screw tight to the inside of the view guide. Now we'll typically run an anchoring screw every 3 to 4 feet. If you have a ceiling grid, you're going to want to hit the T grid with your anchoring screws. Therefore, you'll need to pre-mark the locations of those grids on your view guide. But before you prep your guide, you're going to want to slide in your leveling bolts. The square nut of the leveling bolt will slide into the channel within the guide. We're going to run leveling bolts every 3 to 4 feet. We'll also add a leveling bolt to each end where the L brackets are and use those to lock the L brackets in place. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and prep our view guide and we'll get it installed. Before attaching the view guide to the ceiling, slide in a view L bracket into the end of the view guide. Then slide the view guide over the T bracket and pick up the view guide tight to the ceiling. Once in place, slide the view L bracket so that it's tight to the inside of the wall start. Then tighten the extra leveling bolt we put in tight to the view L bracket. This will hold the view L bracket in place. With the L bracket tightened, attach the L bracket to the inside of the wall start using a 3/4 inch framing screw. With my L bracket in place, I can now run my attaching screws on the inside of the view guide. Run the attaching screws tight to the inside of the view guide and tight to the ceiling. Of the view guide, where we have the T bracket, run the extra leveling bolt tight to that T bracket. With the view guide attached to the ceiling, we can now adjust the leveling bolts for the view track. Before adjusting the leveling bolts, I want to quickly go over the purpose of the leveling bolts. As mentioned at the beginning of this video, the leveling bolts within the view guide are used to level the view track. This is going to apply for both the floor and the ceiling. So for example, if you have a ceiling that's slightly out of level or a floor that's out of level, you can adjust the leveling bolts to level the view track. The main purpose is to make sure the view track is perfectly level on both the ceiling and the floor. Now for swing door situations, we want to maintain a minimum 3/8 inch air gap between the view guide and the top edge of the view track. To do this, you need to set your first leveling bolt so that it is 3/8 of an inch from the top edge of the view guide to the top of the leveling bolt. By setting the 3/8 inch air gap between those two, it'll create the 3/8 air gap between the view guide and the view track. From there, we can then set the leveling bolts so that the view track is perfectly level. Now with that in mind, we'll go ahead and set our leveling bolts. I've went ahead and set my first leveling bolt with a 3/8 inch gap. I can now take my tape measure and see where the laser level is hitting my tape measure to determine what the leveling bolts need to be at so that they are perfectly level. With this measurement, I can now level my two other leveling bolts. With the leveling bolts adjusted, we can now install the view track. The view track will attach to the view guide using 4-inch framing screws. We'll need to prep the view track by pre-drilling 1/4-inch holes at predetermined hole locations. To determine the hole locations, take a look at the view guide attached to the ceiling. We'll need to drill the holes so that we avoid both the leveling bolts and the attaching screws. To do this, just take a tape measure to locate each of those locations. From there, mark the inside of the view track to be drilled with the 1/4-inch drill bit. Once prepped, we can then install the view track. To install the view track, take it to the top of the opening between the wall starts and carefully rotate it into place. Then take your 4-inch framing screw and run it through the pre-drilled holes. You'll run the screw so that it is tight to the leveling bolt. Screw in place, I'll go ahead and put in my two other screws. With the view track installed, we can now move on to measuring for the view tracking guide attaching to the floor. To take the view tracking guide measurement for the floor, we first need to establish the door opening width. To do this, take the door header and place it into the view wall start on one side of the opening. Set the door header on the floor and bring the opposite side wall start tight to the door header. We want a nice tight fit between the door header and the wall start on each side of the opening. With the bottom of the door opening spaced, your door opening should be perfectly square from top to bottom. With our door opening established, we can now measure for the view tracking guide for the floor. To measure for the view tracking guide attaching to the floor, measure from wall start to wall start. As shown in the clip before this, the view tracking guide can be cut to the same length for the floor. Prior to attaching the view guide, we'll need to slide in the leveling bolts. Again, we're going to run the leveling bolts every 3 to 4 feet. We also like to have a leveling bolt on each end of the guide. We'll also need to slide in a view L bracket. The longer portion of the L bracket will need to go into the view guide, and the shorter end of the L bracket will go into the wall start. The reason why we add the L bracket is we're going to anchor the L bracket to the floor and anchor it to the wall start. This will create rigidity for this side of the door opening. So we'll slide in our L bracket, place our track against the wall start on the opposite side, and drop the view guide to the floor. Again, we want to slide that L bracket so it's tight to the inside of the wall start. We'll then attach the L bracket through the center hole of the L bracket with a 3/4 inch framing screw. L bracket attached, we're now going to take our anchoring screw and run it through one of the holes on the view L bracket. With the L bracket anchored in place, we can now run our other anchoring screws. On the other end of the wall start, we're not going to use an L bracket because we're going to anchor it to the floor. Therefore, all you'll need to do is align the center of the view guide with the center of the wall start. How you prep the view track for the anchoring screw is dependent on the type of anchoring screw being used. Now in this case, I just use a standard Phillips headed screw. Therefore, I'm using a Phillips head bit that can fit through the center of the view guide. Now, if you have an anchoring screw with a larger head on it, you may need to use the step bit to prep the view guide to fit your bit into. When you're running your anchoring screws, again, we're going to run them every 3 to 4 feet. With the view guide attached to the floor, we can now set the adjustment for the leveling bolts. Same as the ceiling, we're going to start with the first leveling bolt with a 3/8 inch air gap. With my laser level set up, I'll take my tape measure to see what the leveling bolts need to be at so the view track is perfectly level. With the leveling bolts adjusted properly, I can now install the view track. To install the view track, place it between the wall starts and rotate it onto the leveling bolts. Now we do not attach the view track, it just sits on top of the leveling bolts. With our floor view tracking guide installed, we can now move on to installing the door header and the door jambs. Start with the door header. Place the door header into the wall start and into the flex track on one side. Bring up the other side of the door header into the wall start and the flex track. You'll need to make sure you have a nice tight fit between the door header and the flex track when they come together. Once in place, use a 2.5 inch framing screw and go through the center of the door header. The screws, you need to make sure you have that nice tight fit between the two. If the flex track flares out from tightening the screws, just back your screws out and retighten them so there's a nice flush finish between the door header and the flex track. To measure for the vertical door jambs, we'll measure from the floor to the bottom edge of the flex track. We'll need to take a measurement on each side of the opening because we want the door jambs nice and tight to the floor. I'll go ahead, take my measurements, and we'll get our door jambs cut. Before cutting the door jamb, I wanted to show you where we'll be measuring from on the door jamb to cut the door jamb to the proper length. We'll be measuring from this point of the mitered end of the door jamb down to the measurement we took. We'll only be cutting the square end of the door jamb. To install the vertical door jambs, place the mitered end of the door jamb into the wall start. Take up the door jamb so it creates a nice tight fit between the door header and the door jamb. Once in place, take an 1¼ framing screw and run through the center of the channel on the door jamb. We're going to run 4 screws per door jamb. Tighten our screws. We want to have a nice tight finish between the wall start and the door jamb. So I'll go ahead and finish running my screws on this side, and then I'll move on to this side and install the door jamb on this side of the opening. With the door jambs installed, the framing for a swing door in our View series is complete. Before ending this video, I want to go over the couple major points we discussed throughout this video. The first is making sure your door opening is perfectly plumb and square. This is extremely important to allow the doors to function properly. The second point is making sure your view track for both the ceiling and the floor are perfectly level. This will ensure the glass pieces are square, which will make it easier to install. So with that said, this will conclude the video. If you have any questions, please contact our office.